I'm Lara.
And I'm Tasha, and this is episode 8 and the last of our podcasts on the Royal Worcester Porcelain Factory.
We are two 14-year-olds, both Year 9 students from Nunnery Wood High School. For our podcast project, we have chosen to talk about Mike Braddock, who also happens to be the grandad of our history teacher, Miss Thatcher. He worked at the factory for 40 years as an electrician, maintenance worker and engineer.
This episode should hopefully delight you as Miss Thatcher gave us the opportunity to actually meet her granddad and his wife Anne. We'll tell you more about that later, but first we visited the museum and then listened to an oral history interview with Mike recorded in 2007.
Mike first started working at the Royal Worcester factory in the early 1950s when he was an apprentice electrician. Here he describes what he thought about the factory when he first arrived.
The smell was one thing. I think the aniseed, which it always seemed very welcoming to me when you walked in anywhere near the decorating areas. Parts of the factory was very dirty. We still had bottle kilns. There were still, I think it was 4 porcelain bottle kilns, and so any work we had to do on those, and obviously temperature recording and control was part of our job. You used to get covered in soot. That, I suppose, and the clay dust. But having said that, there was a nice environment. It was always warm. That was another factor. Sometimes too warm, of course. But it was always warm, and the smell of the aniseed, I think, is something that lives with me.
The aniseed was used by the pottery decorators, and the smell hung around the whole of the factory site. That really would have got to my nose.
And the clay dust as well. I recognise this from when we do pottery in school, but not on this scale. As part of his job, Mike had to look after the kilns. These are large hot ovens that the porcelain was put into so it could be cooked or fired and get nice and hard. Electrical engineers were on site 24 hours a day to make sure that this process was nice and safe and done properly. However, in the next clip, Mike talks about a time when there was once a terrible fire in one of the kilns. The fire spread to a room where thousands of Royal Worcester models were stored.
When the fire appeared to me to be under control, there was myself and John Lance. He ended up as a decorating director. I think at that stage he may have been decorating manager. But there was the pair of us there, and the fire brigade had their hoses at the entrance door, sort of trying to hose it down. And we persuaded them to stop the hosing down for a minute or two so we could rescue these models which were on the shelves, and you could just visualise the hose was just going to blast them away. It is amazing when you look back. They were either finished models or nearly finished models of sort of horses and, large models. They weren't figurines, these were large models. It just seemed common sense to me to not to blast them off with the hose when the fire seemed to be under control.
The bravery or madness of rescuing these beautiful objects during a fire, goodness me.
Can you imagine the mess that a fire would have left behind? Thousands of hours of work all destroyed in a matter of moments. Mike's job really was vital to the safety and the continuation of the factory.
Having listened to Mike's oral history interview from 2007, we had an amazing opportunity to meet Mike and his wife Anne in person. It was a chance to hear more stories about their life at the factory, everything from their social life at Royal Worcester to the actual work they did. The first part of our conversation left a real impression on us. It was when Mike talked about the impact of World War II on his education.
We left at 14, I think, wasn't it, Anne?
15, Mike.
15, yeah. In most of those years, the country was at war. So from the age of starting school, for instance, I would have started at 5, and the war started in the late 1939. So the country was at war. The men teachers particularly had been called off to the forces, which left you with lady teachers. Nothing wrong with that, but there was, at that time, I went to a boys' school. So yes, I think it affected our education, yeah. And we didn't go places like you now. I hear of having tours even abroad. I mean, that was unknown. Well, it wasn't unknown before the war, but that was the period when we didn't qualify.
Listening to Mike really showed us how important education really is, and the privileged position we're in now will really help us in the future.
listening to Mike, we realised how much you can learn from people who are actually there. Mike and Anne met at the factory and got married soon after. One thing that really came over was how much they loved each other. It was obvious that they really had a connection between them.
Anne worked as a figure painter in the factory. She painted the porcelain models, which was a really skilled job.
The Royal Worcester porcelain was lovely. I started when I was 15. You have to be sort of arty before you go there, you know. I was always good at art at school. But nothing prepares you for on china. It's not like on paper, nothing.
Yeah.
And it's completely different. But it was lovely, it was really good. You learn to mix your own colours, and then you start on the easy things, of course.
Yeah.
You always start with flesh and the hands and all the flesh first. Yeah. And then you do the dresses and you have a number. You all have given a number, and mine was number 8. So when you've done the first coat of everything, you put your number at the bottom of on the base, and it goes to be fired. Then when it comes back, you know it's yours because you've got number 8 on there. And then you start to do the features, eyebrows and eyes and things like that, and shadow in the clothes and dresses and things. Yeah. Then it goes to be fired again, and then it comes back and you put the extra bits on, you know, just the little finishing touches. You take it to the lady in charge, and she'd tell you, no, that's too dark. Rub it off so it all came off again. So really, it was weeks before you had anything fired until you got the flesh right. The flesh had to be perfect.
When the girls had got it right, they progressed onto a range of models that were really collectible back then. At the start of the project, we went to the Museum of Royal Worcester and saw some of these models, so it was amazing to hear Anne talk about the things we'd actually seen.
You were given better stuff then, you know.
Yeah.
You practised on the real basic stuff, and then we started on the days of the week, Monday's child is full fair face and things, and months of the year and grandmother's dress, parakeet boy. It was all beautiful. And of course you get better and better.
Yeah.
And we used to ask to stay late one night on a Wednesday. It was night school, and you stayed an extra hour, and you could do anything you want on china, but anything, you know. Just go and choose yourself a cup and sauce and do your own pattern, and then you got better and better. But as soon as you were 18, it was hard. You had to go on to piecework, where you had to do, that was real hard slog for me, it really was.
It's funny to think that Anne stayed late after work to improve her painting skills, and we've been staying late after school to make these podcasts. The stories we've heard have given us a small insight into the lives of people who worked at the Royal Worcester. We hope that by sharing them in our podcast, these stories will be listened to for many years to come.
Tasha, do you think that listening to her grandparents inspired Miss Thatcher to become a history teacher?
I don't know. It certainly inspired me. Let's ask her.
Miss Thatcher, why did you become a history teacher?
Oh, wow, okay. Well, the main reason that I became a history teacher was because history has always been my favourite subject. But the reason it's actually always been my favourite subject is probably down to my parents and grandparents and them really instilling in me a love of history and listening to stories and imagining, you know, what life was like in different periods of time. And as you've heard from my grandparents, they are incredible, fascinating humans. And to just sit and listen to their stories has been a real privilege. And it's something that I've always really wanted to pass on to the next generation, which I hope I can do through my teaching and through this podcast series.
I'm afraid that's the end of our podcast series on the workers of Royal Worcester. We'd like to thank Miss Thatcher and her grandparents, Mike and Anne, for inspiring us, and the Museum of Royal Worcester, and oral historian Julia for teaching us about oral history.
And making us realise just how much you can learn from it. We hope that you've enjoyed the series. If you want to listen to the full interviews, they are archived at the museum, which is on the factory site in the heart of Worcester.
Goodbye from us and the rest of the podcast group at Nunnery Wood High School.
Goodbye.